Good evening, everybody. My name is Michael Bloom, and I am the Executive Director of the Jewish Federation Association of Connecticut. We lobby city, state, and federal officials on issues of importance to the Jewish federations, their Jewish service agencies across Connecticut. We are here tonight with the two candidates who are running for the United States Senate, Democratic candidate Chris Murphy and Republican candidate Matt Corey. You will hear from each candidate tonight separately. Each candidate will make an opening statement of about a minute or two. I'll then ask him questions, about 10 or so questions, which will take about 20 or so minutes. And then each candidate will have an opportunity for a closing statement. At the 30-minute mark, one candidate will drop off the Zoom and the other will appear on the Zoom. Let's begin. First up is current United States Senator Chris Murphy. Welcome. In your opening statement, I certainly would love for you to hit on why you are running for re-election. Candidate Murphy, the floor is yours.
Well, Michael, thank you so much for having me, and thanks to all of my friends at the Federation. Really eager for this opportunity tonight to discuss the reasons why I'm running for re-election for my third term in the United States Senate, and to talk a little bit about the work that we have to do together. Listen, I'm running in part because I see an incredibly stark choice in this election between an increasingly divisive, dystopian, and reckless platform of Donald Trump and the modern MAGA Republican Party, and a Democratic Party that sees it as a priority to protect American democracy and to see this country's diversity as our strength. I'm proud to be a former colleague and friend of Kamala Harris's. I am excited for the historic nature of her candidacy, and I think we have tremendous work to do together, whether it be to restore reproductive health care rights for all women across this country, to continue to make sure that the poor and the middle class have what they need to succeed instead of having all of the economic benefits in this country flow to billionaires and corporations, or to continue to work on a passion project for many of us in Connecticut, addressing the epidemic levels of violence in this country that are met by folks who live right down the street from me in the south end of Hartford, or our kids who fear for their life every day that they walk into a classroom. I'm proud to have played a central role in all of that work, the work to protect reproductive freedom, bring good jobs to Connecticut, and to lower the rates of gun violence in this country. But I am especially eager to have a conversation with the federations about the work that we've done together. And I know you are deeply worried about exposure to violence in this country, economic fairness, protecting our freedoms. But we are living in a very perilous moment for Jewish communities in Connecticut and across the nation. Obviously, we see the rising rates of anti-Semitism. It pains me to think about Jewish children in this state fearing for their lives when they go to a synagogue or whether they go to a Jewish school. And we need to act. That's why I've been very supportive of President Biden's initiatives to stamp out anti-Semitism. I think that is a very large, big, and holistic project that we have ahead of us. But it's also why I'm incredibly supportive of Israel's right to defend itself, why I supported their campaign to eliminate Hamas's ability to ever attack Israel ever again. Israel is beset by enemies, and we will talk over the course of this call the ways in which I have had differences with Prime Minister Netanyahu and the nature of the campaign. Make no mistake, Israel has to defend itself against Hamas, against Hezbollah, and against Iran. And as I did in the past, I will continue to support Israel's right to do that and continue to support a robust partnership between the United States and Israel. Israel should learn lessons from some of the mistakes the United States has made in the past, but it remains my belief that the United States-Israel relationship is absolutely vital for our interests here, for our interests in the Middle East, and for Israel's survival. So, Michael, thanks so much for having me on. Eager to talk about a panoply of topics tonight. I know we have short time.
Yes, you've touched on a good couple of them. So one you already touched on, campuses, college campuses specifically, have seen a disturbing rise in anti-Semitism since last October 7th. There are a few pieces of legislation in Congress whose overall aim is to protect Jewish students on campuses from protesters that cross the line, including preventing Jewish students from accessing public parts of campus. Currently, the Senate could vote on the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act, which provides the Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights to take into consider the IHRA, I don't want to speak acronym, International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's definition of anti-Semitism when investigating complaints of anti-Semitism. There is also the Combating Anti-Semitism Act, HR 791, which admittedly is in the House. You have not had a chance to vote on it yet, which would strengthen desperately needed efforts to counter anti-Semitism, and ensure that the current administration and any future administration are focused on fighting anti-Semitism. Assuming the Anti-Semitism Act does not pass the Senate in the next couple of weeks, and because I know it's been held up there for a few months, or the Combating Anti-Semitism doesn't pass in the next handful of weeks, would you support either or both of these pieces of legislation next session if you are elected to Congress or the United States Senate, excuse me?
Sure. Well, listen, let me be clear. While I support the right of any American, including students in this country, to protest their government or foreign governments, there is a clear line that has been crossed over and over again by many protests in this country and by many student protests. And those two lines to me are pretty simple. One, a line in which these protests become incitements to violence. Two, a line in which these protests become blatant anti-Semitism. So I will always support the right of anybody in this country to be able to protest U.S. policy, to be able to protest the government of Israel's policy, to be able to march against a war that they believe is unjust. I won't support anything that jeopardizes the health and safety of the people I represent, and I will not ever stand for anti-Semitism. I think, as you know, I'm a co-sponsor of the Countering Anti-Semitism Act. That's the House bill that you referenced. My hope is that that comes before the Senate, perhaps in a lame duck session for a vote. Much of that act is built upon providing resources and mandates to implement much of President Biden's really comprehensive, really thoughtful order around combating anti-Semitism. What I've learned, especially as the father of two kids who are kind of coming of political age, is that we need to do a much better job of explaining the history that has led to the establishment of a Jewish state in the Middle East. It is not enough to simply talk about the Holocaust. That has to be the beginning and the end of this story. But thousands of years of persecution are part of this story as well, a part of the story that many kids and young people do not understand. And so when they try to grapple with why Israel has to fight so hard for its survival, yes, it is because the Holocaust is a recent memory, but it is also because of a knowledge that for thousands of years, there was no one fighting for Jews in Europe, Asia, or other parts of the world. So I'm eager to support that legislation if it comes to the Senate for a vote.
Thank you for that. One thing, certainly, there's another piece of legislation that the federal government could get behind, whether it's this session or next session, which is the Showing Up for Students Act, which would provide $280 million in additional funding to that U.S. Department of Education Office of Civil Rights. That is the office, for those in the audience, they are the office that follows up on all the complaints of whether it's anti-Semitism or Islamophobia or just blatant racism on college campuses. So additional funding to that specific agency. Would you be supportive? I know everyone is always looking for funding, but such an agency, would you be able to prioritize that if you are, in your case, reelected to the United States Senate?
Well, listen, I'm always supportive of additional funding to enforce to enforce laws, especially laws that are designed to protect the safety of Americans, the safety of students. I am not off the top of my head familiar with that exact piece of legislation. So to the extent that that piece of legislation changes law, I need to take a look at it before I endorsed it. But if the question is whether I'm willing to support additional resources to enforce existing law, certainly.
Thank you. With regards to students again, our national intelligence director a few months ago stated Iran was behind some of the protests. I've seen many congressional hearings over the last year, which has focused on where the sponsors of these protests are getting their money from. Would you be supportive next session, if you are reelected, to additional hearings or future legislation to look at or stop the flow of money, and be supportive of nonprofits actually losing their tax-exempt status if they are receiving money from foreign bad actors?
Well, I think that's a complicated question. And listen, I don't want to presuppose that foreign governments are behind domestic protests. I have many constituents in this state who have very legitimate concerns about the conduct of Israel's war inside Gaza. And I think it stands to reason with the number of civilians that have been killed, the devastation on the ground, and the humanitarian costs of that war, that you would have American citizens standing up and raising issue. I have been amongst those. Folks on this call know that I have had problems with the way in which this war has been conducted. I do not think that Israel has paid enough attention to the civilian cost of this war. I've always defended Israel's right to go after Hamas, but I think that this war could have been waged in a manner that could have been more protective of human life. That does not make me an agent of a foreign government. I'm raising legitimate concerns as a citizen, as a US Senator. So broadly, yes, I'm always interested in the role that foreign governments have to play in American politics. Iran does it, China does it, Russia does it. But I certainly would not disagree with the conclusions of our intelligence agency that Iran, I'm absolutely sure, is delighting in the way in which much of our debate plays out. But I also know that there are plenty of US citizens that have an independent, very legitimate concern with the way in which the war is playing out. I think, to your more specific question of whether I would not support or whether I would hold accountable not-for-profit organizations who take money from our enemies, that's
Yes.
I'm certainly willing to look into that question. I think the definition, right, of who an adversary of the United States is something always up for debate. I have no question as to the fact that Russia and China and Iran are our enemies. There are other countries that might be more debatable. That would be an important and difficult conversation to have if we looked at legislation on that topic. Happy to continue a dialogue about it.
Well, now you bring this up. We shift to foreign policy, which the war is on everyone's minds, and we would all love for this, frankly, to end sooner rather than later. Israel is facing, as I believe you even said, is facing an existential crisis battle with Iran and its proxies. What steps would you take in the next Congress to deal with the constant threat that Iran poses, not just in the country, but again through its proxies to the north and to the south of Israel, actually to the east as well, and Iran not just poses a threat to Israel, but to the West and therefore the United States. And if it is, if it's sanctions, how do you propose the U.S. should go about enforcing them?
Well, let's sort of take the current threat first. Iran's rocket and drone attacks against Israel are unacceptable and unconscionable, and Israel has a right to respond to those attacks. As you know, the United States has been consulting with Israel on those. Israel has a right to respond, and Israel has been consulting with the United States on the nature of that response. I do want to rewind for a moment, though. As many of you know, I was a supporter of the JCPOA, the nuclear agreement between the United States, Europe, Russia, China, and Iran. During the period of time in which the JCPOA was in effect, Iran was not launching military strikes against US forces in the Middle East. Iran was not launching military strikes against Israel. They were more than a year away from a nuclear weapon. Since we withdrew from the JCPOA, everyone is at greater risk. American forces are being fired at. Iran is loading up their proxies with additional support, and they are now weeks away from being able to obtain a nuclear weapon if they want. This is not the moment right now as we speak for diplomacy with Iran. Right now, Iran is shooting at Israel. And so there needs to be a response. In the short term, a military response from Israel, likely paired with additional sanctions from the United States. But in the long run, I think we have to understand that when we have been able to talk to our adversaries, we have been able to keep ourselves safe. So I'll be open to that conversation in the future. But for now, of course, I'm willing to support sanctions. I think they have relatively little impact on Iran's behavior in the region. And of course, I will be eager to sort of hear what comes of the consultations between the United States and Israel on its response. I don't want an escalation of this conflict. That's not good for anybody in the region. And so, well, Israel has to respond. I think we all want to get on a path very soon to de-escalation and a ceasefire, both of the conflict with Lebanon and Hezbollah and the conflict in Gaza.
Thank you. With regard to aid to Israel, you have been a proponent of conditions on the aid of Israel. And you are not alone. There are others in the Senate and Congress that have talked about conditions as recent as last session. However, a growing number of folks in the Democratic Party have now, over the last 3 months, jumped over conditions and gone straight to an arms embargo. And that's the latest talk you see everywhere. If this comes up next session, and you are reelected to the United States Senate, would you be supportive of an arms embargo? And and why? And if not, why?
Well, let's be clear though. The only way that we were able to secure congressional support to fund Israel's response to the October 7th attacks was to defeat Republican opposition to that bill. So over and over again, Republicans were putting up obstacles in front of the bill that would have defended our friends in Ukraine and supported Israel. And it was Democrats, including myself, who negotiated for 6 months an immigration compromise that Republicans demanded as part of the package to support our national security aid to our friends abroad. So I'm proud of the fact that President Biden has stood by the need to defend Israel. I'm proud of the role that Democrats have played to support Israel. Of course, there are elements inside the Democratic Party that are to the left of me. There are elements inside the Republican Party that I think are deeply antithetical to Israel's interests and are aligned with some very problematic elements of the nativist right. But to the extent that I have supported conditions on funding for Israel, it has been no different than the conditions that we place on funding to any of our other partners. I want to make sure that if we are supplying aid to other nations, that aid is being used in compliance with international laws regarding the conduct of war and humanitarian law. I'm not asking to apply anything new or different to Israel. I have not endorsed an arms embargo. I frankly haven't seen any specific proposals for an arms embargo. I certainly know there are some colleagues that no longer want to fund Israel's conduct in Gaza, but I have not endorsed nor have seen any detailed proposals in that nature.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Saudi Arabia. They have been in the news the last not so much lately, but 5 to 10 months ago, they were in the news that they are ready to normalize relations with Israel, which would be an enormous deal. Um, if you are elected United States Senator, what can you do to further the Abraham Accords, or get? I understand the Saudi Arabia deal is contingent on a ceasefire and de-escalation of what's happening in the Middle East. But if what we can do to push Saudi Arabia across the finish line, and maybe what other countries are next in terms of normalizing relations or additional relations between the United States, Israel, whether it's Middle East or Northern Africa. So what could the next Congress do?
I certainly support wholeheartedly the normalization of relations between Saudi Arabia and Israel. And more broadly, I think there is, a very potentially transformative security realignment underfoot in the region. As we saw, especially with respect to the first set of rocket and drone attacks launched by Iran against Israel, it was not just Israel and the United States that stepped up to defend against those attacks. It was our Gulf allies and friends as well. And so there is a architecture in the Middle East that links the Gulf countries, Saudi Arabia included, the United States, Jordan, Egypt, and Israel in a way that would have been unthinkable decades ago. So I, don't want to set our sights too narrow, because I think there is something really important that could benefit US and Israel security interests in the long run. I think the United States should play a role in trying to secure the normalization of relations between Saudi Arabia and Israel. I have spoken at length to President Biden about this and others in his national security team. One of the things, as you know, that Saudi Arabia has asked for, well, they've asked for two things. One, they want the ability to enrich uranium inside Saudi Arabia, something that we normally do not permit our allies to do. And second, they've asked for a security guarantee from the United States. They want to essentially have the same rights as the democracies that we protect in Asia and in Europe. Both of those requests concern me. I think if we gave enrichment abilities to Saudi Arabia, we may come back to rue that decision, because it could sort of take the lid off of a nuclear armed Middle East. And I think we always have to think very carefully about whether we give a security guarantee to any nation, but we currently do not give security guarantees to dictatorships and autocrats. Makes, I think, a lot of people in the United States nervous to provide an American security guarantee to Mohammed bin Salman, who over the last 5 years has regularly acted contrary to American national security interests. I've told the Biden administration and said this publicly, I remain open to any kind of negotiated agreement. But I think some of the requests made by Saudi Arabia are ones that should give any student of the Middle East pause.
Thank you. We'll shift now to Qatar. I know you visited there in 2021. You even you blogged about it. With regards to the war, I want to talk to them in two separate ways. One is with regards to the war. They have been a central piece because they have been directly negotiating with Hamas, but they're also housing Hamas's leadership. I think there was talk that Qatar may kick them out, and I think they went to Turkey to say, Turkey, will you house us? But I haven't seen stories on that lately, so I think they're still in Qatar. So what can the next Congress do with regards to leveraging our relationship with Qatar to further press Hamas into getting him at the table and trying to get a ceasefire done? And the day after, whenever that is.
Right. Well, that's really the most important topic. I mean, it is part of what I have not understood about the Netanyahu government's approach is their refusal to have any serious conversation about what happens after the war ends. My understanding is that they do not want to have that conversation because it poses a political risk to Netanyahu's coalition. But the reality is that needs to be a plan that does not include a permanent Israeli military occupation of Gaza. And I am skeptical that there is a Arab and foreign Muslim force that will ride to the rescue. I think our friends in Saudi Arabia and Qatar and Turkey and Egypt and UAE will be very reluctant to put their own troops in harm's way, given the fact that Hamas will never be completely eliminated. They do not want to be in a shooting war with an Iranian proxy inside Gaza. So I have believed from the start that the Palestinian Authority or some technocratic Palestinian government is going to have to play a role inside Gaza. Qatar is an important ally, as all our allies in the region are. They are imperfect. But, let's be honest. They maintain a relationship with Hamas because we have specifically asked them to do that. They do that at the request and have done that at the request of the United States. They have been the conduit for funding to Hamas over the course of the last 10 years at the request of the Netanyahu government, right? So they play this role as an intermediary because Israel and the United States have asked them to play that intermediary role. And so sometimes people paint Qatar as the bad guy because they are talking to Hamas without recognizing that they do it despite the reputational risk. Because if they weren't providing a conduit for discussion, and prior to October 7th, a conduit to keep people alive inside Gaza, there would be enormous cost to the United States and to Israel. So we will continue to try to press for a ceasefire. I don't believe that the ceasefire is not being agreed to because Qatar isn't doing its job. The ceasefire is not being agreed to because right now the Netanyahu government and Hamas leadership have both independently decided that they cannot agree to the terms.
Okay, thank you for that. Would love to shift to security. The need for additional security dollars is incredibly real. Not just in the Jewish community, there's been a rise in hate across many communities over the last several years. I hear there is a $600 million gap between those that applied for the federal nonprofit security grant and those that received the federal nonprofit security grant. At the Connecticut level, JFACT was able to get the governor to release an additional $5 million for the state security grant program a few months ago. Thank you, Governor Lamont. However, 530 institutions applied and only about 100 received it. So the need is massively real. In the next session, if you are reelected, would you support, there's two parts of this, I'll tie them together. Would you support the nonprofit security grant as much as you can, but not go below the FY24 level? And then the second part of that is, Senator, our communities have been impacted because of the war. Our communities have been impacted because of what's happening in Israel and the surrounding in Gaza and Lebanon, all that's happening. About 10 synagogues locally had bomb threats on Nakba Day, which was about a week after last October 7th. If you are that's one example locally of the impact. If you are elected, would you support a supplemental security package, as there was in FY24, again because of the impact from what's happening in Israel?
Well, I see this threat on a daily basis. Every conversation I have with a Jewish community leader, a rabbi, a synagogue leader, further informs me of the desperate need to increase funding for the not-for-profit security grant program, a program, as you know, that is available to all not-for-profit organizations and all religious organizations. Black churches, mosques also are having record levels of threats lodged against them. But the need is particularly acute in our Jewish communities. I'm the chairman of the committee that writes the budget for the Department of Homeland Security. When I took over that subcommittee, the not-for-profit security grant program was funded somewhere around $100 million a year. Today, that program is funded at $450 million a year. Literally 48 hours after the October 7th attack, I called up a few of my Republican colleagues, and I said, listen, we have to make a statement tomorrow that any national security supplemental that gets passed for Israel has to include a massive increase in the not-for-profit security grant program. And so about 24 hours later after that, I released a bipartisan statement along with Senator Capito, Senator Britt, Senator Booker, and Senator Rosen, laying down a marker and saying, if we're going to pass an emergency supplemental, it has to include these additional funds. As you know, that bill eventually did include about $450 million in additional funding. So I've led on this question of funding these security grants. Agree with you that the number is not high enough, but I think if you look at my record, I have consistently not only supported increases in funding, but have delivered as the chairman of that subcommittee. I know it backwards and forwards. I know the folks who work on it. They do an admirable job, but they need more resources. And listen, I understand what a scary time this is. The discussions you have to have with your kids about the things they hear at school, about what they watch on television, and I know that locked doors and bulletproof glass don't provide all the answers. At least it can provide some level of peace of mind for folks that right now feel gravely under threat.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Look, there's many things I would love to continue, but unfortunately, we're on a tight time frame. So thank you for the opportunity. Thank you for joining us this evening. Would love to give you 2 minutes to make a closing statement on whatever you choose. The floor is yours, Senator.
Well, again, just thanks for the opportunity. This has been a relationship over the time that I've been in Congress that matters. As a senior member of the Foreign Relations Committee, as somebody who oversees the Department of Homeland Security budget, I really rely on all my friends in Connecticut, in particular the federations, to give me good advice. And listen, I appreciate the fact that we have a candid relationship, right? I never ever feel like I can't be completely honest with you about the ways in which I view the Middle East, the ways that I view American foreign policy. We are never going to be in 100% agreement, but you are never going to hear spin from me. I'm going to tell you where I think our policy is right, where it's wrong. I'll tell you where I agree with Israel, where I don't. But I feel lucky to be in a position of leadership, a place where the administration and my colleagues rely on me, whether it's to pass big bipartisan domestic legislation or to help set the national security direction of this country. But no, for me, it always comes back to Connecticut. Everything that I do, everything that I care about is based upon the conversations and the dialogues that I have with people in our state. And at the top of that list of dialogues that matter to me is the long relationship that I've had with many people on this call and the leadership of the federations across the state. So thanks a lot for letting me be a part of this forum tonight.
Thank you. Candidate Corey, welcome. Would love for you to make an opening statement yourself. This is for maybe many on this call is your first opportunity for you to talk to them and them to talk to you. So please, you have 2 minutes or so to make an opening statement and maybe convey why you decided to run for United States Senator. Why you decided to run for United States Senate. The floor is yours.
Hi, my name is Matthew Corey. I'll just give you a little bit of background on myself. I consider myself a blue-collar small business owner, a former Navy veteran. Look, Connecticut needs somebody to bring some unity and some civility back to the United States Senate. I believe I can do that. It's a lot of divisiveness down there in Washington. We need someone that actually is going to work across the aisle. I, Matthew Corey, can work with either administration. I'd like to have debates on what policies would move Connecticut forward and this country forward. Would like to bring the treaty process back and not lose powers to the executive branch. I also would like to have a secure border, an economy that works for everyone, and back our law enforcement. I would like to be a United States Senator that would work across party lines to make sure we have policies that work for America. My opponent wants to get rid of the filibuster, which I would think would destroy that institution. What that tells me is that he's not able to get the consensus on some policies and legislations that would help America. So I want to keep that institution sacred. The United States Senate is sacred. I'd like to be the person to represent Connecticut to make sure that that stays that way.
Appreciate it. You say a small business owner. Do you have one in particular?
Well, I was a high-rise window cleaner for 32 years in the state of Connecticut, so there isn't a city or a town that I haven't worked in or traveled through. I have a different perspective of corporate America. I look into corporate America from the outside, and I've seen a lot of jobs get shipped overseas. A lot of people get laid off between 50 and 60 years old, which is really hurting our state and our economy. It's people that are too young to retire and too old to hire, and they're competing with younger people, and it's really hurting our state of Connecticut. We're on a global market. I'm also been in the hospitality business for 22 years. I currently have 14 employees that, struggling to make ends meet every single day. There's a lot of people that work for me that are taking on two jobs. A lot of kids working for me that are working their way through college and are losing hope. So somebody needs to represent those people in Washington, and I am that person to do that.
Thank you for that, candidate Corey. There are campuses, college campuses specifically, have seen a disturbing rise in anti-Semitism since last October 7th. There are a few pieces of legislation whose overall aim is to protect Jewish students on campus from those protesters that cross the line. Again, not protesters that are protesting normally, but those that are actually preventing Jewish students from accessing public places on campus. Currently, there is a bill in front of the United States Senate called the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act, which provides the Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights to take into consideration the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism when investigating complaints of anti-Semitism. There is also the Combating Anti-Semitism Act, HR 7921, which is currently in the House, which would also strengthen federal efforts to counter anti-Semitism and ensure the next administration and any future administration being focused on fighting anti-Semitism. If either of these don't, I know this may happen, but in case neither of these happen, would you be supportive, if you are elected to the United States Senate, would you be supportive of these pieces of legislation aimed at protecting Jewish students on campus?
I absolutely would be supportive. And it's unfortunate, Michael, in 2024, we are talking about anti-Semitism in this country. If you look at what's happening with countries like Qatar and Iran supporting these institutions, and there's no repercussions for not allowing Jewish students to go to school. Their safety should be number one concern of all of these institutions. Kids should be able to go to school in a safe environment without being persecuted. And the problem is around these universities, there's no accountability. But that's what happens when you have an administration that has no accountability for what's happening around the country. We see our police officers being attacked. We see students being attacked. This is what is happening with our country when you have a breakdown in law and order. But our Jewish students, no matter who they are, should be able to learn in a safe environment and be able to walk our streets, own businesses in a safe environment. And we're not seeing any accountability. And it's a sad fact that that's what's happening around this country.
Thank you for that. Another thing that the federal government can do to protect Jewish students, and quite frankly, all students, from the kind of vitriol and intimidation that Jewish students have been facing over the last year, is to support the Showing Up for Students Act. There's a lot of S's there. Excuse me for stumbling. Yeah, it's another S. This legislation would provide $280 million in additional funding for the U.S. Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights, which is the agency that looks after all of these acts, of whether it's anti-Semitism on campus or Islamophobia or racism. Would you be supportive of funding the Office of Civil Rights at $280 million?
I would be supportive of anything that protects Jewish students from going to school. The problem is our Department of Education is so large. This should be brought back to the state's issues. The Department of Education needs to be dismantled. The bureaucracy is a nightmare. Students should be protected no matter what race you are, what creed you are, what religion you are, but especially with the anti-Semitism that's running around this country today, people need to be prosecuted. Institutions need to be held accountable. I'll be all for that, Michael.
Thank you. With regards to students, our National Intelligence Director stated that Iran was behind some of the protests. I have seen many congressional hearings over the last year which have focused on where the sponsors of these protests are getting their money from. Would you be supportive of additional hearings again next year if you were elected to the United States Senate, or future legislation to look at or to deal with the flowing of money, foreign money, to these nonprofits? And would you consider having nonprofits that receive foreign money from quote unquote bad foreign actors losing their tax exempt status?
Look, if they're not protecting students and we have professors preaching anti-Semitic things, they should lose their funding from the federal government. But they need to be investigated, and I would be all for more hearings. We need to protect students at all levels, and propaganda and anti-Semitism shouldn't be taught on college campuses, period.
Thank you. We will now shift to some foreign policy questions regarding the war in some of the countries specifically. Israel is facing an existential battle against Iran and its proxies. What steps would you take in Congress next year to deal with the constant threat that Iran poses to Israel, to the West, and therefore the United States? And part two of that, if you are asking for sanctions, how do you propose the U.S. should go about enforcing those sanctions?
First and foremost, we need a United States Senator and an administration that supports Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. My opponent is saying Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is continuing these wars without peace talks with Hamas or ceasefires with Hamas, Hezbollah, just for re-election purposes. This is dangerous rhetoric. Israel is under attack. Israel is defending their nation. What happened was everything that my opponent wanted was to remove sanctions, relieve sanctions. He had taken the Houthis off the terrorist organization watch list. Iran is sitting on billions and billions of dollars of oil being sold to China. This is what's happening. They're funding these terrorist organizations that are attacking Israel. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is not perfect. Things happen. October 7th was a tragedy. We need not to hold back strategic arms, funds. We need to make sure that they have intelligence information that they need. Let's not forget, 40 Americans perished. There's still American hostages. God forbid they are not still around. There are hostages still being held. These are the failed foreign policies of removing sanctions. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is now the face of the free world. And the United States, instead of leading from behind, needs full support of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. He would have my full support in the Senate. He would have whatever means he needed to make sure that his country is safe. And they do share intelligence information with the United States. They're not asking for boots on the ground. They are fighting the war for all of us and for the free nations. It is the only democracy in the Middle East. Little story, Michael. I served over in Israel during the 82-83 conflict. I was over there when they blew up the Marine barracks as a United States Navy veteran. Our ship had some mechanical failures. There wasn't a safer port to pull into in the Middle East than Haifa, Israel. The IDF, the Israeli country, took care of our ship. We were broke down for 3 weeks. We pulled out of there safely. You saw what happened to the USS Cole when they pulled into the Yemeni port. We lost our brave men and women and that USS Cole. Lost a lot of my shipmates and sailors. There's not a safer port in the Middle East or a friendlier country in the Middle East than our friends in Israel. And they would have my full support 100%.
Thank you for sharing that story. So I guess my question of would you support an arms embargo to Israel, I suspect I know how you answer, but I'll give you the floor to once again say, would you support that or oppose that?
I would not support an arms embargo. I would oppose that. And I want to thank the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu for taking out the Hezbollah leader. We've waited over 40 years. He was the mastermind behind the embassy and the bombing of the Marine barracks, where we lost so many soldiers and Navy veterans. It was upsetting. Marines, Navy, that was very upsetting, and civilians. So he was on this earth a little too long. There will not be peace around the Middle East unless we get rid of the terrorists. And there is no other country in this world that would ever tolerate what Israel is tolerating. And God bless every one of them.
Thank you for that, Candidate Corey. Saudi Arabia appears ready to normalize relations with Israel, which would be a massive, massive deal. If you win and are elected to the United States Senate, what can you and Congress do to further the Abraham Accords, which were successful in providing economic and normalization with Israel and several countries? What could be next? Getting Saudi Arabia to the finish line, but what else could you and the United States Senate do to improve the United States relations and Israeli relations with other countries?
Look, there needs to be great policy over their economic growth policies. The Palestinian people are suffering. My family has roots in Lebanon. The Lebanese Christians, Lebanon is suffering. If you show economic growth and policies that will free people with peace, that would make the Middle East a great place to live. And look, I know it's going to take years, but Saudi Arabia is a partner of the United States. They were keeping the Houthi rebels in check. There was an arms embargo on Saudi Arabia. We need to support that deal and make sure that there's great trade relationships with Israel and Saudi Arabia. It sends a message throughout the Middle East that peace can be achieved through economic and growth and prosperity. And I would be all for that, Michael. And as a United States Senator, I would be all on board of helping other nations around that Middle East to make sure that they have the same type of opportunities.
Thank you. We'll shift countries to Qatar. I'll ask, there's a couple of different ways I want to talk about Qatar. One of which you actually brought up earlier in your discussion. But with regards to the war, they have been a central figure because they have been negotiating with Hamas while also housing the Hamas leadership. What can you do in the United States Senate if you are elected to leverage our relationship with Qatar, to leverage their relationship with Hamas to get them further to the table and hopefully trying to end this war in the Middle East?
But Qatar was housing the Hamas leaders with a combined income of $11 billion. They're not a friend. They're not a friend of the United States. We need to put more pressure, economic pressure if it has to be. We need true leadership that leads from the front and not behind. We need to put more pressure on Qatar to make sure that they are helping in any way in this peace process. It's a tricky place in the Middle East, but Qatar is no friend of the United States at this moment when you're housing the leaders of Hamas and not holding them responsible for what is happening in Palestine to the Palestinian people.
I appreciate that. One question following up on that is Qatar has been active in donating billions of dollars to universities over the last several years. While not every university Qatar has donated to has seen an exponential increase in post October 7th anti-Israel activity. Several have, including Cornell, Northwestern, Rutgers, Harvard, and one in our backyard, Yale. And I should say they are not the only foreign country giving money to colleges, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and China, to name a few. But talking again, Qatar, because they have been in the news and because of their relationship with Hamas and housing Hamas and trying to strike a deal. I think it's just, are they, I know you alluded to this in your last question, but are they friend? Are they foe? Are they a peacemaker? Are they a sheep's in wolf's clothing? What are your thoughts specifically on what Congress can do with foreign money coming into our universities that, I want to say I don't want to completely paint a 100% or zero picture, but that may be leading to certain colleges, certain hirings of folks that leading to massively anti-Israel activity?
Listen, we talked about that earlier, so we have to investigate some of these professors that are professing anti-Semitism around the campus. Once again, if these universities are accepting money and they're not letting Jewish students and they're professing anti-Semitism, they need to be held accountable. Why is this money flowing into these universities, these kids being indoctrinated with anti-Semitism and hate, now allowing Jewish students, or any students, allowing Jewish students to go and learn in a safe environment is completely wrong, and people need to be held accountable, especially a country like Qatar. We need to do that, whether it's sanctions, That's what needs to be, then we need to deal with that leadership over there, deal with the universities here in this country and find out what is going on and hold them accountable. But once again, we have an administration that does not hold anybody accountable. So we need to do that. I mean, this is what's happening. That's a breakdown in society when people have actions, whether it's on college campuses from students, from activists out there that are not being held accountable and just being released. And it just happens over and over and over again. And you see it sparking up again all around this country. Nothing happened the last semester. And hopefully there'll be some accountability in this semester that Jewish students can travel to school safely and not preach anti-Semitism on these campuses. And the federal government, if they're getting funded, needs to be cut off immediately.
Thank you for that answer. Going to shift to security. The need for additional security dollars is incredibly real, and it's not just in the Jewish community. It's in many communities. There has been a consistent rise in hate throughout not just our community, but the United States and frankly the world the last several years. I hear there is a $600 million gap between those that applied for the federal nonprofit security grant and those that received it. At the local Connecticut level, JFACT was able to get the governor to release an additional $5 million for the state security nonprofit security grant program. Thank you, Governor Lamont, a few months ago. But there, 530 institutions applied, but only about 100 received it. Therefore, do the math, about 400 or so institutions didn't receive the funding that they needed. So clearly there is an ongoing need. If you are elected to the United States Senate, would you be supportive of funding the nonprofit security grant program with as much as you can? I would say not go below the FY24 level, which I think was around the low $400 million. So would you be supportive of funding the nonprofit security grant program for sure?
Yes, absolutely. I would be all for that.
Thank you. And there was actually, I should say, unfortunately, because of the tragedy of last October 7th, there was an additional security package that was created called the Supplemental Security Package for those communities specifically that are dealing or impacted because of what is happening in Israel, what is happening with the war in the Middle East. Would you be supportive of a supplemental security package, again, for security dollars? One example locally, there was what was called the Nakba Day, which was it was about a week or so after last October 7th, and we had at least 10 synagogues being receiving a bomb threat. So there has been an impact, and that's not the only example locally. So there has been an impact. Would you be supportive of a supplemental security package for our local communities?
Absolutely. We need to keep our synagogues, our people safe. The problem is the defund police is really affecting every community. Law enforcement has a tough time recruiting, whether it's on the local or state level. We need funds to make sure our communities are safe, that we back law enforcement. And I don't believe my opponent can say the same, who's supported by the Working Families Party. But we need security, not only at synagogues, but around our communities to keep everyone safe. And anti-Semitism has no place in the United States or any community or any church. And that's where I stand with that, Michael.
Thank you for well, that was very quick. I appreciate your answers. Would love for you to take a minute or two closing statement. You can the floor is yours, and how you'd like to wrap this up.
Michael, thank you very much. And to the Jewish community that's listening out there, I can promise you have 100% support from United States Senator Matthew Corey. Look, I'm a small business guy. I have a vested interest in Connecticut. I live in Connecticut. I have 14 employees. We're all struggling out here with a struggling economy. We need to secure our border, back our law enforcement, and we need an economy that works for everyone. Taxes are a huge issue. Energy is a huge issue. We need pro-growth policies here in Connecticut that not only work for the youth, but work for our elderly who are living paycheck to paycheck or on fixed incomes. We also need policy peace through strength around the world. We need to support our allies. Appeasement policies do not work. The previous administration had peace through strength. There wasn't a war around the world. We need a United States Senator that's going to stand strong, somebody that has served in the military, understands the consequences of war. We need peace, and peace through strength we shall have as your next United States Senator. I thank you very much for having me on, Michael. And
My
you're up.
absolute pleasure. Thank you for taking the time. And with that, I would like to thank all of you for joining us. For those, we are recording this, so we will be sending this out and we'll post it to our YouTube channel. We'll be sending that out so others that weren't able to join us were able to see us. But I appreciate all of you for joining us. Hope you had an easy fast yesterday, and happy New Year, and take care.